It all started with flashing red and blue lights, my own keys clutched in Karen's hand, and an officer barking at me to get on the ground. My crime: I had just unlocked the front door of my own house. Karen, the HOA president, had seen me step out of a moving van in sweats and a baseball cap and decided that was suspicious enough to call the cop. She was already outside when the squad car pulled up, flapping papers in her hand like she was serving a court order. Except she wasn't. She was waving my deed around like a rabid referee, yelling that I was impersonating a homeowner. The officer started reaching for his cuffs. That's when I pulled out a leather folder from my duffel and handed it over. Inside was a letter signed by the governor of our state. A thank you. A gift deed. Official, notarized, and airtight. Karen's face contorted like she'd swallowed a lemon made of embarrassment and regret. But this was only the beginning. I thought it was over with that letter. I had no idea it would start a suburban war. The house was a classic craftsman tucked into the nicest gated neighborhood this side of the valley. Picture-perfect hedges, fountains, and driveways paved like chessboards. I hadn't even planned on living there permanently, but when the governor handed me the keys in a small ceremony after the wildfire response project I led, I accepted with quiet gratitude. I'd spent 18 months coordinating emergency protocols for wildland fire evacuations across the entire state. That year, not one child or elder died in the path of a disaster. The governor called it a miracle. I called it a good team and hard work. He called me a hero and insisted on gifting me this house that had been seized in a corruption case and restored to the state. I never expected it to be a battleground. The day I moved in, I was met by a neatly folded pamphlet shoved in the mailbox titled HOA Expectations, a Guide to Harmonious Living. There were no friendly faces, no handshakes, just cameras pivoting toward my truck like I was dropping off contraband. I unloaded in peace until a woman in a linen blouse and oversized sunglasses appeared on the sidewalk like a specter. She didn't introduce herself. She just pointed at the gate badge on my windshield and said it wasn't registered. I calmly explained who I was. She blinked, then smirked, then said, and I quote, "That's a bold story. Got any proof you're not just the moving guy?" Then she asked for my keys. I laughed, thinking it was a joke. She didn't. She reached out and snatched them off the rail where I'd set them down. Before I could say a word, she was on the phone with the police. I kept my cool. I'd dealt with plenty of bureaucrats and micromanagers before. I figured I'd show her the paperwork, the police would nod and leave, and we'd move on. But she was faster. She waved down the patrol before I even had time to open my bag. When they showed up, she practically shoved them at me, spinning this story about a man posing as a new homeowner with suspicious documents and a forged signature. The cop didn't ask questions, just gestured to the ground and said we'd sort it out at the station. That's when I revealed the leather folder. Inside were 3 documents: the state deed, the notarized certificate of property transfer, and a personal thank you letter from the governor printed on official stationery. One glance at the seal was all it took. The officer's face changed instantly. He apologized, helped me up, and returned my keys. Karen didn't apologize. She just stood there frozen like a child caught stealing. Her mouth opened and closed, but no words came out. I walked past her, into my house, and locked the door with a quiet click. I thought that would be the end. A misunderstanding, albeit a rude one, resolved. But Karen wasn't done. The next day, my trash wasn't collected. The following morning, a warning appeared taped to my garage door saying my lawn was non-compliant due to unapproved grass height. My mailbox was taped shut with a fluorescent pink sticker labeled "Hold for HOA Review." I laughed it off. But inside, I started documenting everything. I wasn't just dealing with a nosy neighbor. I was facing someone with power, a title, and apparently nothing better to do. A week in, I met a neighbor while watering my front hedges. She leaned in and whispered that Karen had started a petition to verify the validity of my residence. Petition to verify I live in the home gifted to me by the state. It sounded insane. And yet, some neighbors were nervous. Karen told them that my presence jeopardized their insurance rates, that I might be some kind of inside political scandal hiding behind forged papers. The gossip spread like grease on a griddle. I kept quiet. I didn't post online. I didn't argue in the HOA forum. I didn't knock on doors. I let her think I was backing down. What I did do was visit City Hall, request a copy of the HOA charter, confirm the exemptions listed in the state deed, and hire a local attorney with experience in homeowner association dispute. Just in case. Then I installed cameras. Not flashy ones. Discreet, high-resolution, motion-triggered cameras that quietly watched every inch of my property. And boy, did they start catching things. Karen had her goons, the so-called HOA compliance team, making rounds past my home twice a day. One morning, they hovered at the side fence and poked at my irrigation system. Another evening, someone sprayed chalk lines across my sidewalk and tagged my driveway with orange flags. All in the name of regulation. She was trying to provoke me into making a mistake. But I didn't react. I gathered evidence. I filed logs. And I waited. My lawyer and I prepared a cease and desist. I filed complaints with the postal inspector over the mail tampering. But more importantly, I started attending HOA board meetings. Quietly. I sat in the back row with a notebook, nodding politely, speaking only when absolutely necessary. That's when Karen noticed something had changed. She wasn't sure what I was planning, but she felt the shift. And then came the day she lost it. She showed up at my front door again, this time with a clipboard and a ridiculous checklist claiming she needed to inspect the inside of my house for compliance verification. I asked her under what authority. She pointed to her HOA badge. I asked again. She didn't have an answer. She tried to push past me. I stepped aside and let the security camera above us record everything. I didn't touch her. Didn't raise my voice. But the footage was gold. I sent it to my lawyer and the governor's aide. I sent it to the city housing authority. And then I sat back and waited. Karen still thought she was winning. But she had no idea what storm she had just invited into her kingdom. The days that followed Karen's doorstep ambush revealed just how far she was willing to go to drive me out. My mailbox stayed sealed with HOA violation stickers, despite 3 official complaints filed with the postal inspector. My trash was skipped 2 weeks in a row, and when I called the waste service, they told me someone from the HOA had flagged my address as under investigation for contamination. What kind of contamination? I asked. They didn't have an answer. Just that the hold would stay until cleared by the HOA board. Of course, Karen ran that board like it was a kingdom, and I was the uninvited invader. But I wasn't about to play by her script. I kept recording. Every skipped pickup. Every HOA patrol slowing down to snap pictures of my property. Every bogus fine taped to my garage. Then came the community bulletin. A glossy monthly newsletter, mailed to every home, filled with gardening tips, safety reminders, and community updates. But this edition had a strange entry in the HOA announcements section. A paragraph warning homeowners to be cautious of unverified occupants, and urging neighbors to report suspicious activities near a certain lot number. Mine. My address wasn't named directly, but the coordinates matched. The wording was clever, vague enough to avoid slander, but loaded with implication. I knew exactly who had written it. Karen was trying to isolate me, to make me a pariah. I expected the cold shoulders and suspicious looks. What I didn't expect was the email I received that evening. It came from a neighbor 2 streets over. Her name was Janice, and she'd lived in the neighborhood for 8 years. The message was short. Just a screenshot of the HOA group chat and a line of text beneath it that read, "Thought you should know what she's telling people." The screenshot was damning. Karen was spreading lies. She claimed I'd forged government documents, that I was connected to a scandal involving misuse of emergency funds, and that the house was being illegally occupied until the governor cleared the matter. There was even a manipulated photo where she tried to blur the governor's signature on the certificate I'd shown the police, claiming it was digitally altered. I laughed when I saw it. It was pathetic. But I also knew what she was doing. She wanted fear, doubt, isolation. Make me look like a fraud long enough, and maybe she'd pressure the board into evicting me. That's when I knew I couldn't just defend myself. I had to go on offense, quietly but effectively. I printed the chat logs, all of them, highlighted Karen's messages, forwarded them to my lawyer and the governor's aide. I also sent a copy to a local journalist I knew from years ago, someone who now covered community disputes and political meddling. She said it sounded interesting. She'd keep an eye on it. Meanwhile, Karen escalated. I noticed 2 small drone flights over my property. One hovered outside my bedroom window for a full 2 minutes before zipping off. Another circled low over the backyard while I was on a video call. I checked my own footage later and traced the launch point, her backyard. She was surveilling me. I documented everything. Time stamps, angles, proximity violations. I called the FAA to report unauthorized drone activity over private property. It was a slow-moving process, but one I knew would build pressure. Then came the flyer campaign. Someone had printed cheap paper flyers and stuffed them into mailboxes along the street. The headline read, "Who really owns Lot 47?" It listed cherry-picked quotes from old online articles, mostly about the governor's housing policies and government surplus. It tried to paint the picture of me as a political pawn placed in the community for optics. A symbol, not a citizen. It was laughably wrong, but effective to the paranoid. I watched 3 neighbors cross the street to avoid me the next day. One lady even locked her car as I walked by on the sidewalk. But it wasn't all darkness. A few neighbors began reaching out quietly. Some dropped by with baked goods, an old neighborhood peace gesture. One man stopped to compliment my yard work and said, with a glance over his shoulder, that not everyone agreed with how she does things. These subtle shifts told me Karen's grip was slipping, even if only slightly. But I wasn't ready to make a big move yet. I needed something definitive, something undeniable. So I went to the source. I scheduled a meeting with the governor's legal advisor. I laid out the harassment, the flyers, the surveillance, the smear campaign. He listened carefully, reviewed my documents, and then said words I'll never forget. "We gave you that property free and clear. There are exemptions built into the grant. If the HOA is violating your right to occupy or enjoy the residence, they're in breach of municipal contract." I asked what that meant. He leaned forward and said, "It means they've overstepped. If you want to make this public, we'll back you." That was the turning point. I didn't go public. Not yet. But I did write an open letter. Professionally written. Calm, clear, and signed by both myself and the governor's office. I attached a scanned copy of the original deed and the exemption clause buried in the HOA's own bylaws, Section 4.7.2, which stated that properties granted through state recognition programs were not subject to HOA interference unless safety violations were confirmed by a third-party inspector. No such violations existed. I printed the letter. I mailed it to every resident. Karen lost it. She tried to ban the letter from being distributed through the community Dropbox, claimed it was unsolicited political material. But she failed to realize one thing. I'd also emailed it, and posted it on the community forum, and shared it in the neighborhood's unofficial Facebook group, which I learned was far more active than Karen's version. Within hours, dozens of comments poured in. Some skeptical, many curious, and a handful furious, at her. The next morning, the HOA's complaint line was overwhelmed. Residents were demanding to know why they hadn't been told the house was legally exempt. Why resources were being spent on harassing a decorated public servant instead of fixing potholes and broken pool gate. Karen tried to post a rebuttal. It was a mess. Accusations, deflection, thinly veiled insult. Someone replied with the governor's letter. Another posted the drone footage. One brave soul asked, Why are you so obsessed with this man's lawn? That night, for the first time in weeks, my trash was picked up. My mailbox was unsealed. A couple of lawn flags disappeared. Karen didn't make an appearance, but I could feel her presence watching through her curtains. This wasn't over. But it was the first time she'd tasted pushback she couldn't control. I stood in my yard, arms crossed, watching as the street slowly returned to normal around me. Birds chirped, sprinklers ticked, and deep in the shadows of her throne, Karen realized the battle was no longer hers alone. The war was coming, and I was ready. It wasn't long after the neighborhood began whispering that Karen tried to regain control by staging a formal HOA inspection. A letter arrived in my mailbox typed in all caps and printed on HOA letterhead that looked like it had been designed in Microsoft Paint. It claimed that due to numerous resident complaints, my property had been flagged for a full exterior and partial interior inspection. It cited vague clauses from the HOA charter, none of which actually applied to my legally exempt home, but that didn't stop her from listing a specific date and time when I was expected to comply. She even included a checklist of items that would be evaluated, ranging from fence alignment to attic storage compliance. It was absurd, laughable even. But what stood out most was the final line. Failure to cooperate would result in escalating enforcement measures, including fines and a possible vote for eviction. That's when I knew she was running out of ideas. Karen was swinging wildly now, hoping I'd take a wrong step. But what she didn't know was that I'd already laid the groundwork for my response. On the day of the so-called inspection, I installed a folding table right outside my front door. On it, I neatly arranged 3 printed copies of the deed, the governor's certificate of exemption, and the HOA charter with section 4.7.2 highlighted in bold yellow. I also placed a fresh pitcher of lemonade with 2 glasses. I wasn't angry. I was prepared. She arrived flanked by 2 members of the compliance team, retired men with clipboards and the desperate energy of people who finally felt powerful again. Karen was in full war regalia, khakis, heels, a wide-brimmed hat, and a whistle that bounced around her neck like she was about to referee a soccer match. She barely glanced at the documents as she announced they would begin with the backyard. I calmly said they wouldn't be stepping onto the property without a warrant or written consent, both of which they lacked. She puffed up and threatened to call the sheriff. I pointed at the camera mounted just above the door and told her to smile. The older man behind her laughed under his breath. She stormed off, and I assumed that would be the end of it. But 2 nights later, while reviewing the footage from my motion-activated cameras, I caught her. Just after midnight, Karen crept along the side of my property with a flashlight in one hand and a measuring tape in the other. She tiptoed across the mulch bed, measured the distance between 2 fence posts, then scribbled something in her notebook. She was trespassing. I downloaded the footage and sent it to my attorney. Then, just for fun, I emailed a copy to the community group chat under the subject line, HOA President hard at work. By morning, it had hundreds of views and a cascade of popcorn emojis in the comments. That morning, I received an email from a local journalist who had seen the footage online. She wanted to know if I'd be willing to talk. I agreed cautiously. We met at a diner just outside the neighborhood. I told her everything, starting from the day Karen called the police on me, right up to her midnight surveillance. She was stunned, especially when I showed her the state-issued exemption and explained how the property had been gifted to me by the governor's office. She asked for permission to verify the documents and run the story. I gave it. I told her I wasn't looking for fame or revenge. I just wanted the harassment to stop. She nodded and said sometimes the only way to stop a tyrant is to shine a spotlight. Meanwhile, Karen was busy preparing for her counterattack. She organized a secret HOA meeting, this time without sending me the standard notice. Fortunately, one of the newer board members, a quiet but sharp man named Omar, tipped me off. He told me they were planning to vote on a special motion to remove my exemptions due to what Karen called unethical conduct and manipulation of legal loopholes. It was nonsense, but it also meant she was desperate. I thanked Omar and asked him to keep watching. I had my own plan in motion. The story hit the local news the following week. A full 2-minute segment aired on the evening broadcast titled Hero Harassed by HOA. It showed clips of the governor awarding me the home, footage of Karen trying to block my property access, and interviews with residents who were fed up with her antics. One neighbor said she hadn't been able to paint her door for 3 years because Karen kept changing the color rules. Another revealed Karen once fined her for leaving her recycling bin out 12 minutes past the deadline. My story was just the tipping point. The public sentiment shifted overnight. Comments poured in online, most of them in disbelief. Viewers mocked Karen's behavior and praised the idea of an HOA president finally being held accountable. But what mattered most was the phone call I received the next day. It was from the governor's chief legal aide. He said, in a tone mixed with humor and irritation, that the governor had seen the report and wasn't happy about how his gesture was being weaponized by a suburban HOA with too much free time. Then he added something else. The governor wanted to come visit. That was the moment I knew the endgame had begun. I didn't need to escalate. I just needed to clear the path. So I filed a formal complaint with the city's housing commission and attached every piece of evidence I had: trespassing footage, false inspection letters, harassment messages, and the viral videos. I also included my correspondence with the governor's office, showing not only my legal rights but the repeated efforts I'd made to de-escalate. The commission opened an inquiry immediately. It wasn't fast, but it was enough to freeze the HOA's power to fine or enforce new penalties until the matter was reviewed. Karen didn't take it well. She tried to rally her board, but cracks were showing. One member resigned. Another submitted a motion to reduce Karen's discretionary authority pending investigation. Residents started attending board meetings in droves, something that hadn't happened in years. At one meeting, someone actually brought a folding chair and a bag of popcorn. Karen was losing her grip, and she knew it. Her final move was her boldest. She sent me an official letter, again typed in angry caps, declaring that my property would be subject to a special emergency vote of the HOA to determine whether I should be forcibly removed for causing neighborhood unrest. I posted the letter online. It went viral again. And this time, the governor's office responded publicly. They released a statement affirming the legality of the gift, my right to occupy the home free of HOA interference, and their disappointment in how a community meant to symbolize progress had turned into a petty battlefield. They didn't name Karen. They didn't have to. Everyone knew. The press descended like vultures on a buffet. Karen's name became the face of HOA overreach. Memes circulated within hours. One even had her face photoshopped onto a medieval queen screaming at peasants. The community, the board, and Karen herself were now under a spotlight too bright to escape. But I wasn't done yet. I had one final move left. One that would turn the tide completely in my favor. I didn't just want peace. I wanted to ensure no one else ever faced what I had. The next step wasn't about me. It was about changing the system Karen had so expertly abused. And I had the perfect opportunity to do it. Because in 2 weeks, the HOA board would face an open community vote. And I was about to make my debut. Not as a victim, but as a candidate. The days leading up to the HOA community vote were unlike anything the neighborhood had ever seen. Flyers began circulating, not from Karen this time, but from other residents, ones who had stayed silent too long and finally found their voices. They shared their own experiences, the petty fines, the sudden inspections, the threat letters worded just like mine, and even how Karen had demanded to see one woman's bathroom remodel plans before approving a garden statue. The grip she had over the board was unraveling by the hour. But I wasn't celebrating yet. I had one goal in mind, and I wasn't letting ego or revenge distract me from it. I was running for a seat on the HOA board, Not to become another tyrant, but to fix the mess from within and make sure no one ever had to record surveillance footage of their own mailbox just to get their rights respected. My campaign wasn't flashy. I didn't go door to door or hand out buttons. I just posted a statement online and in the community center. Clear, respectful, backed by fact. It outlined my background in public service, the legality of my residence, the pattern of abuse I'd faced, and most importantly, the plan I had to change the structure of the HOA for the better. Term limits, transparency rules, a rotating compliance committee instead of a permanent one handpicked by Karen. It wasn't about throwing her out for vengeance. It was about uprooting the power structure she'd twisted for so long that it felt normal. That message hit home harder than I expected. Within a day, the post had dozens of comments in support. One said, "It's about time someone with a brain and a backbone stepped up." Another said, "I voted for Karen 10 years ago. I'm so sorry." Karen, of course, was still fighting like a cornered raccoon. She issued her own letter condemning me as a disruptive outsider backed by political strings. She accused me of orchestrating the media attacks, manipulating residents, and having a secret agenda to dissolve the HOA altogether. Ironically, that last one earned me more support than anything else I had written. People were exhausted. They were tired of the way every fence slat, porch light, and flower pot was a potential violation. Tired of HOA board meetings that felt more like court hearings than community discussions. Karen's paranoia had become her own undoing. The vote was scheduled for a Saturday morning in the community center gym. By 9 a.m., the parking lot was full. People showed up in jogging clothes, in robes, some with babies, others with folding chairs and coffee cup. It felt less like a vote and more like a town hall revolution. Karen sat near the front of the room, her expression carved in stone, flanked by two loyalists who looked like they hadn't smiled since 1994. The rest of the board looked uncomfortable, like they were waiting for a storm to pass but didn't know which way the wind was blowing. I stood in the back, quietly observing, my folder tucked under my arm, not to prove anything anymore, just habit at this point. When it was time for candidates to speak, Karen went first. Her tone was icy, her words defensive and overly rehearsed. She painted a picture of chaos if she were removed, warning that the community would dissolve into unkempt lawns and unruly neighbors if her rules weren't enforced. She framed herself as a protector of order. The room was silent, not in reverence, but in discomfort. It was like watching someone perform a play in a language no one spoke anymore. When she was done, she didn't sit down. She stayed at the podium, arms crossed, as if daring anyone to speak after her. I walked to the front with no note. I didn't need any. I started with a story, not about Karen but about the wildfires from 2 years ago. I told them about the communities we had to evacuate, the nights with no sleep, the people who had lost everything. I told them how the house I now lived in had once belonged to a corrupt contractor who had embezzled state funds, and how, after we reclaimed it, the governor gave it to me as a symbol of what public service still meant. I told them I didn't want special treatment. I just wanted fair treatment. I looked around the room, met as many eyes as I could, and said the only thing that mattered. I'm not here to control you. I'm here to stop anyone else from thinking they can. The vote was anonymous, but the results were loud. 3 seats were up for election. I won the first with the highest number of votes in HOA history. The second and third went to 2 residents who had once been on Karen's side but had switched after the last year of her abuses. Karen didn't just lose. She was outvoted, outnumbered, and outmaneuvered. There were no fireworks, no dramatic walkouts. Just a slow, silent exodus of control from her hands. The next few weeks were spent rebuilding. I pushed for immediate reforms. Cameras were banned from being aimed at other people's homes. Fines had to be approved by at least 3 separate board members. We introduced a public transparency board where every complaint, violation, and decision had to be logged and posted. Karen, now a regular homeowner with no authority, tried to attend the meetings. She was allowed in, but her comments were limited to the same 3-minute slot every resident got. She hated it. She tried once to filibuster, ranted about conspiracies and political influence, but no one listened. The mic was cut at 3 minutes, and we moved on to discussing new benches for the park. The most poetic moment came on a Saturday when the governor visited. Not for a political stunt, but for a ribbon-cutting ceremony. The HOA had finally agreed to donate a portion of unused land for a local emergency response training site. The very idea Karen had once tried to block because she thought it would bring too many boots into the neighborhood. The governor shook my hand, smiled for the cameras, and whispered, "Not bad for a guy who was almost arrested in his own driveway." We laughed. The ribbon was cut. A banner flew overhead that read, "Community first, always." Karen watched from a distance. She stood behind the tree line near the tennis courts, wearing those same oversized sunglasses and that wide-brimmed hat like a suburban villain in Exile. She couldn't do anything now. No clipboard, no badge, no authority. Just a woman with too many grudges and nowhere to put them. Some people whispered that she was still trying to collect complaints from neighbors, trying to build a case for a comeback. But no one really listened anymore. That evening, I sat on my porch for the first time in months without looking over my shoulder. The lights across the neighborhood twinkled peacefully. A group of kids rode their bikes past my driveway, one waving as he zoomed by. A neighbor walked her dog and nodded with a smile. For the first time since moving in, it felt like a community, not a surveillance state. And all it took was one battle, one spotlight, and the decision to fight smart instead of loud. I didn't need revenge. I just needed restoration. And now, the gate was closed behind the chaos. Finally, the house I was gifted became what it was meant to be. A home. It had been exactly 6 months since the vote that ended Karen's reign, and the neighborhood had transformed in ways most people hadn't thought possible. The anxiety that once hovered in the air like static electricity had dissipated. People had started to repaint their homes in colors they actually liked. Lawn ornaments that had long been banned under Karen's visual harmony policy began to spring up in yards like tiny acts of rebellion. Families once afraid of fines started hosting small block parties again. The neighborhood newsletter, which used to feel like a list of commandments, now featured actual community stories, photos of backyard gardens, kids' lemonade stands, and volunteer drives. The HOA was finally functioning the way it was supposed to, as a group of people managing shared responsibilities, not as a surveillance tool for someone's fragile ego. I still served on the board, and I didn't take it lightly. But the real work wasn't just about rules or policy. It was about rebuilding trust. Karen hadn't disappeared, but her presence was like background noise now. She still lived in the same house, still wore her sunglasses like armor, and walked her tiny dog like it was a badge of honor. She still glared when she passed by my place, still refused to wave or nod even when other neighbors greeted her. But no one was listening to her anymore. At the last meeting she attended, she tried to complain about a neighbor's newly installed solar panels reflecting into her bedroom. The board politely reminded her that sunlight wasn't regulated under the current bylaws. The room chuckled, and she stormed out with the same stiff posture that had become her signature. That was the last time she tried to speak publicly. Most days she just sulked past, clutching a clipboard that hadn't had power in months. But while Karen faded, something else had quietly grown. A stronger sense of community. People who hadn't known their neighbors for years now exchanged numbers, shared tools, even built a community pantry. One elderly couple who had been too afraid to attend board meetings during Karen's tenure now showed up every month and baked cookies for the attendees. One of them even joked that HOA meetings had become more fun than book club. I smiled at that. Fun was never the point, but it was a welcome side effect. The biggest change came when a local nonprofit approached the board with a proposal. They wanted to use part of our unused greenbelt to host monthly emergency response training for local high school students, basic CPR, fire evacuation drills, disaster prep workshop. It was exactly the kind of community-focused initiative Karen used to block, fearing it would attract outsiders. This time, the board approved it unanimously. I offered to coordinate the first event myself, given my background, and it ended up drawing more residents than we'd ever seen at a board meeting. Parents came with their kids, some even brought folding chairs and snacks. The event wasn't just useful, it was a celebration of what the neighborhood had become. In the weeks after, I started getting letters. Not official ones, just handwritten notes left in my mailbox. One thanked me for making the neighborhood feel human again. Another said, "My kids can ride their bikes without fear of fines now. Thank you." The one that stuck with me most was from a man I barely knew, a veteran who'd lived in the neighborhood for over a decade. It said, "I fought for this country, but you fought for this street. You made it worth coming home to." I kept that one folded in my wallet. But of course, peace doesn't mean forgetting. There was still unfinished business. The HOA had formally documented Karen's abuses and forwarded them to the city's Neighborhood Oversight Committee. There were consequences coming. Not criminal, she hadn't broken any laws in ways that could be prosecuted, but administrative. The committee opened an ethics review, one that could bar her from serving on any future HOA board in the city. When the notice arrived, she tried one last tactic. She knocked on my door. It was the first time she'd looked me in the eye since the day she called the police on me. She didn't apologize. Of course she didn't. Instead, she spoke in clipped sentences, said the review was biased, and that she just wanted me to know she wouldn't forget what I'd done. I let her speak. Then I replied calmly, "I didn't do anything to you, Karen. I just stopped you from doing it to everyone else." I closed the door. That was the last time we ever exchanged words. Months later, a delivery truck accidentally blocked part of my driveway while dropping off new fencing panels for a neighbor. It wasn't a big deal. I waited, the guy apologized, and everything was fine. But it reminded me of something. That very first day, when Karen saw me move in and assumed I was a threat just because I looked different from the polo shirt stereotype she'd built the neighborhood around. The way she called the police. The way she tried to take my keys. I thought about how different it could have gone if I hadn't had the letter from the governor, or if the police had been more aggressive, or if I hadn't kept my composure. That memory never fully left me. It was a reminder that people like Karen weren't just nosy. They could be dangerous when left unchecked. So I made one final change. I submitted a motion to the HOA board to create a formal community welcome committee, not one led by the board, but by residents. A team of neighbors that would visit new homeowners, explain the real guidelines, and hand them a welcome kit with contact info, local events, and resources. The goal was simple. No one would ever feel like a stranger in their own home again. The board voted yes unanimously. The first kit went out 2 weeks later. The story of how I got the house still floats around. Some neighbors tell it like a modern fable. Others mention it in passing with a shake of the head and a smirk. No one talks about Karen much anymore. She's become part of the landscape, like an old tree that used to block the view but now just stands in the corner, slowly fading into the background. She still walks the dog. Still wears the hat. But now she walks past birthday parties, neighborhood barbecues, and kids drawing chalk monsters on driveways without saying a word. The silence is its own kind of ending. As for me, I still live here. Not because I was gifted the house or because I beat Karen, but because it became a place worth staying. Every morning, I water my lawn, sip coffee on the porch, and nod to the neighbors walking by. Some stop to chat. Some wave from across the street. The sound of drills and saws fill the weekends. Not from construction violations, but from people finally fixing up their homes the way they want to. There's laughter now, casual conversations over fences, impromptu soccer matches in the cul-de-sac. It's not perfect. No community ever is. But it's honest. And earned. And after everything, I'd take that over perfect any day. Because the real victory wasn't proving Karen wrong. It was proving that neighborhoods don't belong to the loudest voice or the person with the most forms to file. They belong to the people willing to show up, listen, and fight, not for control, but for each other.